strong level of support it receives from our community. If you're enjoying the festival, consider making a donation to ensure we can all meet again here next year. You can do this online at Humanities Tennessee's website, within the festival app, here on site at headquarters, or by Venmo, new this year, at Humanities Tennessee. All right, that's the housekeeping, so let's get to the reason we're all here. Rachel Kushner has received worldwide acclaim for her novels, which include National Book Award finalists Telex from Cuba and The Flamethrowers. Her writing has been compared to icons like Robert Stone, Dennis Johnson, and Joan Didion. It is intelligent and full of ideas, yet also completely electric, robust, and grounded in the reality of any character she creates, whether it's a former dancer serving time in prison or a young woman discovering the New York art scene in the 1970s. Readers of Rachel's new collection, The Hard Crowd, will learn part of the reason for this is that Rachel's fiction is often inspired by lived experience. As she writes in The Hard Crowd, I decided that the real world places and people I knew would never be in books unless I wrote the books. Some of the essays in journalism here dive into the topics and eras that she addresses in her fiction. Others take on societal issues like prison abolition, or discuss literary giants like Cormac McCarthy and Marguerite Duras. And yes, you pronounce the S. Not to mention musings on motorcycles and muscle cars, there is truly something for everyone in this collection. Joining Rachel to discuss all these topics and more is musician Kevin Morby. He released his 7th studio album, This Is a Photograph, in May, and he's currently on tour. In fact, you can catch him tonight at the Basement East. Rachel and Kevin will be in conversation for about 30 minutes, but we're saving some time for a Q&A at the end. So please hold on to any questions that come to mind while they're talking. And they're both happy to answer questions. The Hard Crowd is available for purchase at the Parnassus tent, and a portion of all book sales support the festival, so go grab a copy if you haven't already, and bring it over to the autograph tent, where Rachel will be signing after the event. And now, please join me in welcoming Rachel Kushner and Kevin Morby.
I know you know how to use a microphone.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Kevin.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, well, I should say the same. Thanks for
Thank you for
doing this event with me.
Yes. How's it going today? How's it feel to be in Nashville?
It's been a weird day. I was in the airport in New Haven, and this lady goes, "You can't wear those pants in the airport."
Really?
Yeah. And I said, "Why?" And she's like, "There's too many zippers on your pants." And I said, "We're not going into a prison right now. Like, this isn't a metal detector."
Wow, that's someone who worked for the TSA?
No, she was just some lady in line.
Wow.
But that's how my day's going. And then this guy picked me up from the airport here and dropped me at the wrong address, and it was in front of a bail bonds place.
It seems sort of a Kushner-esque thing to happen.
I guess that's sort of why I'm continuing to air it, even though it happened an hour ago.
I love it. So and then you go home tomorrow.
Yeah.
And we're both on tour right now. And I mean, do you do this often?
His tour is a lot more glamorous than my tour. You know, my events are like the New Yorker Festival or
that sounds glamorous
like
to me.
The university.
Mine are like dive clubs around the world that smell.
Kevin has been. So, how many places have you played?
Well,
on this tour.
On this tour, maybe we're probably at number like 15 or 16.
15 or 16.
And then maybe like at 20 to go. It's a very long tour.
It's like 30 cities altogether?
Yes, something like that. It's a 7-week tour, which is that's a big one even for me. I think, they say that rock and roll is a young man's game, and I'm 34 now. And 7 weeks is a lot to handle, but doing my best.
And do you travel like Marilyn Monroe did, meaning like with your psychoanalyst by your side?
Yep, psychoanalyst by my side. I've got my own bed in the back. Just kidding. Nothing like that. it's just on a bus with 12 other people, just, smelling each other and being around each other all day long. But then I get to come do cool things like this, and it's amazing.
Yeah, we just overlapped.
We overlapped, and so to get started here, I wanted to talk to you. I'm going to pull out my notes here. I've been a big fan of Rachel's for a while, and I had a record come out this year called This Is a Photograph, and I wrote a lot of it in Memphis, Tennessee. I was living out of a hotel called the Peabody, and I told Rachel this recently, but I felt that her books were sort of the soundtrack to me making this album, which is a funny word to use, saying there's a soundtrack, because obviously I was reading these books, I wasn't listening to them. And I felt a kinship to the characters in Rachel's books, in your essays, that it was interesting being in the South and reading these, because I was thinking to myself, within the hard crowd, or within Flamethrowers, or within the Mars Room, none of this was really taking place in the South, yet I felt this weird connection to, what was taking place in them. And then Rachel and I did an interview for Interview Magazine, and I remember wanting to go into that interview, and the first thing I was going to ask you is your relationship to the South. But then 2 days before we did the interview, my publicist wrote me and said, Rachel had this great new story come out in The New Yorker, and it's called The King Alone, and it takes place in Nashville. And it kind of blew my mind, because I was literally planning on going into this conversation asking you if you would ever write about the South or your relationship to the South. And then here was this story that was kind of touching on all of these things that I felt were also speaking to me during my writing process. And it just felt like a really nice thing to happen. And then we did this interview. And so I know we discussed it a little bit there, but being in Nashville, I kind of want to just ask you the same question again. And I know that you grew up in Oregon, and then you spent a lot of time in the Bay Area, and a lot of your writing takes place in the Bay Area. But what is your relationship to the South, and how did that story come about?
Thanks for all that and asking about that. This one guy just got up and left. Do you think we drove him away? He was like, this isn't children's story hour.
When that happens, it's always such a profound thing when someone leaves. That happened the other night. I was on stage and I was singing, and I was like, oh, I'm really feeling this. And one guy just got up and left. And I messed up the words, because I was like, oh, he's leaving. And then I kind of like choked on my words, and then I looked back and the whole band was laughing. Anyways.
Okay, I'm moving on from it. I'm not from the South. I lived in Eugene, Oregon when I was little, which is was a kind of hippie mecca in the 1970s, but then moved to San Francisco when I was 10. So kind of my adolescent formative years all took place there, junior high school, and then I lived there later. But my mother is from Chattanooga, Tennessee, and I lived for a little while in Asheville, which I know you had mentioned, oh yeah, that's kind of a hippie place, but my friend and I moved there on Greyhound. We just got on the bus at the Port Authority in New York City. We had $500 between us, and she knew one person in Asheville, and we had no plans. And this was, I guess, a different era when you could kind of do things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think either one of us had a credit card or anything like that, but we thought Asheville was going to be the South. And then we got there, and there were hippies who smelled like patchouli selling tie-dye T-shirts, and we just thought, no, we're from San Francisco, from the Haight-Ashbury, we hate this stuff. We thought it was going to be pecan pie,
Sure.
Just this kind of really sort of cliched idea of what the South should be.
Right. I kind of like that you ended up there in a way, being from the Pacific Northwest, because I've always said that Asheville is kind of like the Portland of the South.
Right. And see, we didn't know that. But there are aspects of Asheville that are very not
Sure.
Portland. I lived this was in the 90s, we lived in West Asheville. I worked at the International House of Pancakes, and I had coworkers there who thought they knew me from Shoney's.
Oh, wow.
And I figured that out when one of them, she was trying to convince the manager to assign me to a better section where it would be busier and you would get more tips,
Wow.
on a Sunday morning. And maybe she was just being nice, but she was like, oh, I've known her forever. We worked at Shoney's together. And I was like, oh my God, they think I worked with them at Shoney's.
Amazing.
So that's kind of not Portland, It was
Sure.
I don't know if that's West Asheville or not. If anybody here is from Asheville, it was on Tunnel Road, right near the Greyhound station. But so when I went to write that story, like the story is about a guy who is a songwriter, and he is driving through the South and kind of retracing his steps from a previous trip that he took. And he goes to visit his daughter in Nashville, and she has moved away, and he realizes he has no idea how to contact her. And she's a grown woman who he did not raise from her younger childhood. And he's like coming to terms with the idea that they are estranged, and also that he really hasn't been her father and has no right to even seek her out. And then he's driving and processing that, and he picks up a hitchhiker who turns out he thinks it's a man, and then he realizes at a certain point, like, the guy's really skinny and weird and has weird movements, and his hair is in a baseball cap, and he takes the cap off, and the hair comes tumbling out, and it's a woman. And he becomes really afraid because the person is not who he anticipated him to be. And in writing it, like, he goes from Asheville to Nashville. I'm trying to reconstruct this. But it allowed me to revisit a lot of things about the South that I experienced just driving through, and also places in Asheville that I knew when I lived there. I mean, this is like true of everywhere, but the vividness of the places does not diminish just because the places are gone. And that's part of what you have to reckon with when you're writing. Like, my friend and I would go to this place called Greek Diner, and the woman who worked there was so mysterious to us. Like, she was as glamorous as Loretta Lynn, but maybe Greek, had this accent, and just shit-faced drunk all the time. And when I look on the map, nothing is there but just kudzu. And I don't know if it buried that place or what happened to it, but all of these sites in Asheville are gone. So the story was, in a way, I mean, the larger structure of it was about the psychology of the story and what happens with this man and why he's visited by this woman who's almost like a ghost, the hitchhiker from the side of the road. But beyond that, it was like a gift to myself to go back into these sites and see them and describe them, because they're gone.
Amazing. I love that. And then they're there forever in your story.
Yeah, I guess that's true. And like, I hadn't figured out that the Greyhound station in Asheville doesn't exist any longer.
Oh, wow.
Now it's just, I think you can buy a bus ticket at like the Stop and Go, it's like a 7-Eleven.
Did you physically go back to Asheville to work on the story?
I did not, no. I have gone back to Asheville since I lived there. Like, I did a big return trip with my mother, who, as I mentioned, is from Chattanooga, and she said, let's go to the International House of Pancakes. We were treating it like it's like my alma mater, the way like some people go back to Yale. I just did a reading at Yale. I felt I am not from the Ivy League, and it was like, you can feel that they are, and they know they are, and they love to return to it. The alumni of 1961 were staying at my hotel. But she was like, let's go back to the International House of Pancakes, and I thought, oh, come on. I mean, it's an international franchise, replicated the same everywhere, same blue vinyl booths, same everything. They don't even cook stuff there. It's just packages of things that look like those kind of generic brands from the 80s. If anybody remembers that, it would just say like beer on the can, and it was white with black. It just says pancakes, and then everything you just add water.
Wow.
They just add water.
That's how they do it. That's how the sausage is made.
But my mother was right. So we went into that IHOP and we sat down across from each other, and I was just plunged into sense memory. Like, it's separate from being a franchise, is a very specific place. And when I don't know if you ever worked in the service industry.
I did, and it's funny you saying all this. I had a very similar experience just like 1 month ago with my first job ever. I was at an Indian restaurant and did this exact same thing. Still in Kansas City, but I went back for the first time, and I too was flooded with sense memory. But the old chef there who owns the place, named Zubair, was there, and he brought out my food, and he didn't recognize who I was. It'd been almost 20 years. And as I ate this food, after just seeing him, I cried a little bit because of the sense memory was just so intense. It really is, yeah.
Yeah, I think there's like something about just the service industry, maybe, like the way that you familiarize yourself with the space and the smells of it,
sure.
and like who you become at work.
For sure. And then being when you get sort of the keys to a place like that most everyone sees, like in, the daylight hours or during business hours, but you have these moments to yourself where you're opening up or locking out. There's an intimacy there, and then, being back in them. but being served as if you're just anybody else who didn't have these intimate moments in their place. It's a very interesting thing.
That's exactly right. Yeah, like you become an outsider to it,
Exactly.
but you have inside knowledge.
Right. So it felt good. Did they like roll out the red carpet when you pulled?
No, I don't even think it was there might have been, I was really good friends with a dishwasher. His name was Willie. And he would always be telling me about his exploits in Greenville, South Carolina,
Nice.
which I think people went to Greenville to party.
Mm-hmm.
Not, I don't think because they had like no blue laws or something, but honestly, I think like, just to put something very bluntly, like there were historically incredible black neighborhoods of Asheville that were kind of destroyed by zoning and what they were calling urban renewal projects. And then there are parts of Greenville, South Carolina, where like Willie, all his friends lived, and they were just like cool, chill black neighborhoods where he's like has friends, is not going to be hassled, and he would go there and party on the weekends. But then he would be in a salty mood because he was hungover.
Sure.
And I would go, "How are you doing, Willie?" And he would go, "Man, I went to Greenville last night." And it was kind of like saying like, just do not get in my way
Don't
today.
ask. Yeah, yeah. That's great. Something we've talked about that I really love about your writing, and it seems like you do both. And in terms of my last record when I was working on it, it's really the first time that I felt like I went to the source. You know, there was something that was sort of pushing me in the direction of a certain era and a certain place, and I wanted to go there and see for myself. But when I was talking to you recently, you were mentioning your writing room that you have in LA, and you said this thing that I love, where you said you like to bring the world to you. You like to bring the world into your room and sort of build the world around you. And I really love the idea of that. I mean, I have my own sort of writing space, but I've never thought to sort of detail it in that way, bringing in artifacts from all over. And yeah, I like that a lot. But also, you have told me there have been times where you have, I guess, not done the research, but you've gone to the thing. When we're talking about how you came up with the ending of the Mars Room, you were saying that, you wrote it inside of a tree.
It's true, I did.
So I guess my question is, do you prefer one over the other, or if you're writing inside of this room and you're bringing the world to you, at what point do you feel, okay, I've done as much as I can here in this room, I need to now go out and seek out this experience?
It's such a great question. It really is like, it's the fundamental thing of being a writer, which is, if I could try to lasso it into words, like what part of me is present and in the world and hungry for and open to experience, and what part of me is retreated from the world and only like a watcher who's kind of standing backed up against the corner looking at things, like partaking or just observing and knowing and not partaking and standing at a distance. And I think that like life kind of, at least for me, has moved in a sort of pattern where there was a large portion of it that was all present. I wanted to be in the present. And part of that is also about other people, like wanting to see yourself have an impact on other people and feel them having an impact on you. And like, it's this burning feeling, their need to be alive, that I felt in my 20s. And it really wasn't until like my late 20s that I started to more recede into this private space, which is required to do the work of writing. And it's fun to say that the desk is the center of the world, because then you resolve the contradiction of having to be open and be alive and feel that kind of present experience, and also to be retreated, like, and not have what some people call FOMO, you know?
Sure.
I don't have the FOMO thing, but yeah, so my office is like, I tried to make it look like Freud's office in London, but he was alive at a time where it was like okay and politically acceptable to just plunder all these priceless artifacts from North Africa. And I just have thrift store stuff from Bakersfield, California. But it looks really cool. And then I have these like little teeny lights everywhere. And I feel like they're like the harbor lights, so that if a ship comes in the middle of the night, it knows where to dock. But then I tell myself, like, I've already done all my living. I've known a lot of people. I've done a lot of stuff. I've worked a lot of jobs. I'm not, by the way, one of those writers. Some people in their bio, they're like, has been a bricklayer and an envelope stuffer and a blah, blah, blah. I never include any of this stuff. Just assume we've all done, But I've sometimes told myself, like, I've already had enough experiences. It's just time to stay home and do the work. But it's not true, and one wants to always stay open to the new. And it just, I think, comes in like waves and wavelets. This summer, I had a lucky life. I got to go to France with my family. And I was with my husband and my son in this part of France there's all caves. There's a whole underground world there. And the underground goes as deep as our knowledge of what's above us, to the limits of the top of the atmosphere. Maybe not exact same spatially, but conceptually, yes. There's this mysterious world down below that I know nothing about. And my son has a taste of it because he goes to this camp and the director is a hydrologist and he has keys to these different gates, and you open them up and they just go down for a mile down into the ground. So he showed me this grate that they go down, down, down into. And then it was off of this road that was a winding switchback road. And we walked down the winding switchback road, and then there's a large old stone rectangular open bath that's called a lavoir. And the lavoir is a 1,000-year-old wash basin where women would sit around and wash clothes. And the two are connected because the water that's trickling down into the earth that my son has waded through way down in this cave has an outlet that goes out to the lavoir. And it's very cold, and you feel cold air coming out from deep in the earth there. And I got this chill because I saw that the women who are sitting around this lavoir 1,000 years ago washing clothes are in relationship to the deep underground because their hands are touching water that's been way inside the earth. And I thought, it's not all over with. I can't get that in the office. I guess that's my answer.
There's so much to take away from that story. Also, your son sounds incredible. I like that he had explored all of this and then was showing it to his mother. He sounds way cooler than I was at his age. That's amazing. It's funny even just listening to you talk and, we've had some email correspondences and obviously reading your books. Recently, I played at a venue that you know well called the Fillmore in San Francisco, the legendary Fillmore. And Rachel, you used to bartend there. And we were talking about it, and you said something along the lines of, at the time that I was bartending there, I felt that I had reached the pinnacle of my life. And what I want to say is, listening to you talk, and like I was just saying, and even some of the email correspondences, I would compare it to someone who just has it would be like someone who just has a natural gift of singing. And you're like, when did you decide that you were just going to do this for a living? Because it was obviously there all along. And I don't know what you were like in those days or how you sounded or how you wrote in those days. But being a writer, now it's your career. And at one point in time, you thought that it wasn't going to be. When did you realize that about yourself? Or is it something that you always wanted to do? How did all that come to be?
How did I go from thinking the pinnacle was pouring drinks at the Fillmore to something a little more ambitious than that? Yeah. By the way, I just remembered hearing you ask this question. That I think the first question I asked you when we did this conversation together for interview was how you learned how to sing, because you have such a beautiful voice.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, yeah, I wanted to be a writer when I was younger. I mean, I always wrote when I was little and wrote poetry and kept a diary, but I think most people did. So I'm sometimes suspicious of that answer, like when you see an artist interviewed and they're like, well, I always drew. And you're like, we all drew, So it's not clear who is gonna really have what it takes to make a life out of language. Mm-hmm. And some of the most exquisitely articulate people I've known, who I think have the most beautiful novels inside of them, have not had the wherewithal to write those books. So I think it is a strange confluence of qualities that results in somebody kind of having the follow through to make a book. And I still don't really know what the formula, the ingredient list is. But just for me, I wanted to be a writer in high school, and then I went to college at Berkeley, and was very caught up in politics at that time of my life. It was the 1980s, and the United States was like funding an illegal counterinsurgency in El Salvador, and or a counterinsurgency in Nicaragua, and funding the government in El Salvador. And like, I sort of thought the moral wars of my time would play themselves out there, and I paid a lot of attention to that. And then I moved back to San Francisco, which is, I mean, all props to San Francisco, but I didn't hang around with or really grow up with people who had big time ambitions. There were a couple kids who became professional skateboarders. I mean, these are very ambitious people, but who also dropped out of school in 8th grade.
Who are mentioned in your essay, The Hard Crowd.
That's true, yeah, Tommy Guerrero, who I went to school with. Like, my brother went to college, and he was older than me, but I was like more out into street culture than he was, like out there hanging out, and those were my people. And so I like moved back to San Francisco and hung out with my townie friends, and then I got a bartending job in the Tenderloin, and then from there I ascended the heights of like working at the coolest clubs, and sort of thought that that was, you know, what you do. I did not have a 5-year plan. I was just a kind of bohemian. But I took a poetry workshop at this funny place called New College on Valencia Street, and became friends with my teacher, Lynn Haginian. And she said, like, you could be a writer. And I don't know, it was like a weird time in my life. I was really into motorcycles and racing motorcycles, and she just sat me down and she said, you know, I ran away with a 19-year-old guy and left my husband and my children, and we rode motorcycles in Mexico. And I don't know, she was just sort of telling me that she'd had a wild life, but became a writer, like focused on the desk,
Sure.
I guess. And maybe that was of influence to me. And so then I applied to writing programs and moved to New York City because I wanted to be where I could meet other people who had literary ambitions, because that just really wasn't, at least it wasn't the prevailing culture that I had access to in San Francisco. If it existed there, I didn't really know about it.
Amazing. That woman sounds incredible. I could see you bestowing the same advice to someone someday. Sorry. So you moved to New York City. Do you remember the first thing that you wrote? What's one of the first things where you felt like someone gave you the advice or said you could be a writer? What did you do with that seed? And like, did you take it? Because I feel like we all need that. We all need that person to sort of pat us on the back, coming from a cool position, and give us that encouragement. Do you remember the first thing you sort of did with that advice?
Yes, actually. Well, the first thing that I had written. I'd been working on stuff like you have to have pieces of fiction to apply to a program and all that. But the first thing that I wrote with the intention of maybe publishing it is actually in this new book of mine, The Hard Crowd. It's the first essay. It's called Girl on a Motorcycle. And it's about this race that I did called the Cabo 1000, where you span the entire length of the Baja Peninsula in a single day from Tijuana to Cabo San Lucas. And I did it on a 600 Kawasaki Ninja and didn't make it all the way down. You have to read the essay to find out what happened, but it was a full adventure. My motorcycle was stolen, and then I got it back. So what happened was I was working at this magazine. You know, I had to make a living in New York City. So I was an editor at this magazine, Bomb, and they asked me to do an interview for them. I interviewed the filmmaker Kenneth Lonergan. I had no idea what I was doing, and he was really sweet and generous about the whole thing. And then they let me have a bio, even though I was just the managing editor and a girl who worked in the office. The woman who was the editor-in-chief was very generous to us, and she said, "You'll do something for the magazine too," and then, "Oh, we need your bio." And I didn't have anything to put in the bio because I had not proven myself at all. And so I did do that thing where people put the kind of quirky accomplishment. I said, Rachel Kushner competed in the 1993 Cabo 1000
Amazing.
On a 600 Ninja. And a guy from a publishing company called the office and asked to talk to me, and he asked to meet. And he said that he was editing an anthology of writers on motorcycle riding. And he said, maybe you should write about the Cabo 1000.
Amazing.
And so I remember went to my cousin's farm in upstate New York and sat down at a desk and just tried to write out everything that had happened. And I started working on that essay in 1998. And I think the race was it was either 93 or 94. And it felt like a long time before, but when I think back on that now, if I wouldn't have written it then, there are so many details that would just be lost forever, like
Sure.
gone, because I did not keep a notebook. And there are some very specific things about just how I prepped the bike and who was on that trip, and all this crazy stuff
Wow.
happened. And then people later died in that race, and they shut it down. And, you know, like a lot of those people that were on the race with me are now gone from motorcycle accidents. But so that was the thing. And then this guy published it in this anthology. And then when I went to write the book of essays, I looked at it and I thought, this should be the first essay in this book, because it was the first thing I ever wrote to publish. And it has a kind of, it's different probably stylistically than my writing now, but it's not that different.
Sure. Yeah.
It has something in it that I recognize.
That's also amazing. And I love sort of, there's a part of the hard crowd that feels to me almost like a greatest hits, or how I would compile a sort of looking over my catalog and wanting to put like the best song from each album or something. And you do see your voice shift and sort of change. And I love that that's the first story that you wrote, and that's what you chose to put first. And then, you know, you end it with the title essay, The Hard Crowd. And that essay speaks so deeply to me, because I feel like, at least in my own personal experience, I come from I don't know, I always refer to it as a punk scene. You know, I lived in New York in the early 2000s, and I was a part of these punk houses and these punk scenes. And it's funny because a lot of the bands that you mention in the hard crowd were the bands that we were listening to and trying to emulate, but you were really on the ground floor of those things.
Like the New York hardcore thing, like
Yeah.
Gorilla Biscuits
Exactly.
and the Cro-Mags and all that.
Exactly.
So did you have like short hair? Were you straight edge?
I wasn't straight edge, but I had, my hair was all over the place. You know, I remember this one time that I was getting a haircut when I was 19 years old in this era. And I remember walking into a place that said, haircut's $5. And I walked in, and I remember I had been at this punk house called the Kansas House, because a lot of Kansans like myself were living in this punk house. And
This is in like Queens?
Crown Heights.
All right.
Crown Heights, Brooklyn. So I remember going into this place, and it was $5, and I remember telling the guy, you know, just shape it up a little bit. And it was like my hair was all over the place, and it was dyed black, and he started to cut my hair, and about halfway through, he's asking me all these strange questions, and I think he was like, so where do you work? And I think I smelled really bad, and anyways, halfway through this haircut, I just told him to stop. I was like, he was making me nervous for some reason, and I was like, you know what, you can just stop. And he's like, what do you mean stop? And I was like, I'm good on the haircut. And so he stopped, so like half my hair was really short and half remained really long. And I had that haircut. I took that haircut around New York for the next couple of months with me. So
I love that you had the wherewithal to tell him to stop. When I'm in someone else's hands, like a barber chair,
it's like being in a doctor.
I completely freeze and become so passive, and I have no voice. It's like it's gone.
I think it was just because it was like an interrogation. He just kept asking things, and then he asked if I lived at the boys' home or something like that. And
Right.
it just started to feel a little weird. And then I remember
He was like, son, I'm going to give you what we call the pre-civil rights buzz cut.
just shave it all off. But I remember he called his boss over, and then they spoke to each other, and then in the end he said, all right, looks cool.
Oh, he called his boss over to see if he was allowed to let you go?
Yes, and even I could have just
Whoa.
walked away, I guess, and given him my $5.
And so then
or maybe $2.50.
You were like that for a while? You were just like
I was like that for a while. That kind of
Kansas
became
House asymmetry? Did
yes,
you start a trend?
exactly. Kansas House asymmetry. But you know, so I feel like I have my own version of the hard crowd. And when I was reading your essay, and part of why it spoke to me so much, and I'm going to butcher this line, but there is something that you say in it. I am baffled by the gallery of souls I've known. And you're able to bring out these characters, and as a songwriter myself, I feel like there's an element, or it almost feels like a sense of duty to document certain things, to document certain people and certain lives, and you come from a scene, and you want people to take that into the future, and there to be a documentation of it. And I really get that sense from you, but at the same time, I feel like you've lived this wondrous, very adventurous life. The motorcycle race you're just talking about, it sounds completely amazing, so romantic. And so I feel like you have both. You have both the sense to see it in other people, but then it also, you have the experience behind you as well. And when I was making my last record, I remember wanting to I remember referencing to the photographer, I want to look as tough as Rachel Kushner looks, on the cover of the Hard Crowd. She's in front of this Galaxy 500. She looks so cool. She's always writing about cars. How do I get that sort of toughness and that effortlessly coolness? So I guess
I can only fall in front of Kevin's eyes.
This is all just a very roundabout way of saying, where did the fascination with automobiles begin? And how did you get into riding motorcycles? And what cars do you own today?
So, yeah, I was always into cars for some reason. We lived near a drag strip when I was little, and my brother was really into Big Daddy Don Garlitz, who was a dragster. And, you know, it was the 70s, and so that kind of like crazy car Von Dutch pinstriping was very in style, and Rat Fink was a big deal. So I was just immersed in that kind of through my brother, I guess. But then he didn't end up really into cars at all. Oh, also, there was a guy on our street who had a 1967 Pontiac GTO that was primered red. People know what like primer red is, like a kind of rust color. You know, it's like primer gray, but it's red. And he had scratched into the rear quarter panel Vicky's toy. And he would go racing up and down the street, like going 100 miles an hour. And I just thought it was the most exciting and terrifying thing I'd ever seen. And it was like, I never saw Vicky up close. I just knew about Vicky's toy.
Amazing.
So that probably had an early influence on me. And then my dad has a Vincent Black Shadow, which is a kind of actually extremely rare British motorcycle. And he would start that up on the weekends and take it to like a rally where there's some other guys who have old British motorcycles, or also like really old Indians and Hendersons and Harley Davidsons. And he kind of hung out with some motorcycle people growing up. And then we moved to the Bay Area, and I had an aunt who kind of hung out with sort of more like motorcycle gang. She's younger, like motorcycle gang.
So it was in the
type
family.
People. A little bit, yeah. And I just always thought, and then I had a very good friend in high school who raced motocross and dune buggies, and I was not allowed to ride on the back of his motorcycle because my parents said motorcycles were dangerous. But my dad rides a Vincent, which is a 1,000cc motor and was the fastest motorcycle like of its time.
Wow.
So his, the rule didn't really feel like I should take it seriously. So I would always be on the back of my friend's motorcycle, but didn't have passenger pegs. It wasn't street legal. He'd pick me up on the corner. We'd be like running from the cops on a YZ 250. Anyway, as soon as I was old enough and not living with my parents, I bought a Moto Guzzi and just tried to learn how to work on it. I'm not really good with mechanical stuff, but you have to know a little with those bikes because they're really temperamental, and the carburetors are constantly needing to like be taken apart and cleaned and rejetted. And then I moved from there into like faster bikes, the Ninja. And then I kind of exhausted my interest in motorcycles when people started dying left and right. And I thought, I don't really love riding enough to risk my life for it.
Sure.
So then I got a 1964 Galaxy 500 two-door hardtop coupe. It has the like crease on the back that sort of looks like a convertible, but it's a hardtop. I bought that in like 1995. It was my first car. And then I had a 63 Impala that I bought in North Carolina. I ended up selling that, and I regret selling it, but what's done is done. I still have my Galaxy. And when I got a Guggenheim Fellowship, I got it repainted, and now it has this really beautiful rainbow flake clear coat on the body.
And that's what's on the cover of the Hard
And
Crowd.
a pearl finish on the top. It's true. It has a better paint job than on the cover. Same colors, though. It's a Chrysler color called Black Cherry and a Ford color on top called Wimbledon White.
I can tell you really love this car because every time I bring up, you say, but it's got a new paint job, which I'd love to see someday. Going back to the music thing a little bit, and what I was saying about feeling like your writing was soundtracking me making a record, how much does the outside influence of music or film or things that are not writing influence your writing?
Hugely. I love that question. Yeah, I guess hugely. And I don't know, like how things trickle in is mysterious, but film is really important to me. And I noticed that it's always kind of it's either explicitly in novels that I write, or I'm stealing things from movies and translating them into fiction. And when they make that very extreme terrain change, like going from the road to the soft sandy berm or something, it's not, I don't think it's plagiarism, because you're just like, the thing wouldn't exist in that form. Like, I was watching this very strange movie by Marguerite Duras called India Song when I was writing my first novel. And it has this like colonial languor, and there's these very glamorous people lying around in a hotel with palm fronds and this like Spanish piano music. And I just started taking snippets of the dialogue from that movie and writing it into the dialogue of my book. So things like that happened to me, but also like in The Flamethrowers, the character goes home and she starts watching the movie Wanda by Barbara Loden on TV, and I thought, oh, it'd be fun for me to just write a formal description of this movie, scene by scene, and then try to edit it down into something that, you know, only requires a page to take place. But I'm still, there's certain movies that I think hold so much mystery inside of them. Like, there'll be like an old movie where there's, you know, perfume and makeup on a dresser, and I start to think about, where are those objects now? Like, do they still exist? And there's certain movies that I come back to again and again. I just introduced a screening of Robert Frank's movie about the Rolling Stones, Cocksucker Blues, in Los Angeles. I've introduced it before, and each time I see that movie, I like it more, because I feel like Robert Frank was Swiss, and he came to the South. They come through Nashville. And it's almost like it took an outsider to show certain aspects of America to itself. I mean, that's what my aunt said about Robert Frank's book, The Americans. She said, I never understood where I grew up. And she grew up, you know, like the boys from the military school in Chattanooga were still wearing Confederate soldiers at the Cotton Ball, et cetera. She said she never could appreciate the South until she saw the way that Robert Frank depicted it. So, like, I love Cocksucker Blues, and I just wrote something about it. I have this column for Harper's. So, yes, other things, and music, too. Kevin's music. I'm going to see your show tonight, and that's like being out of the office, being at the lavoir, communing with the women who washed clothes there 1,000 years ago, is on par with being able to see a really great musician and his whole band, and also watching the crowd. Like, I saw his band play in Los Angeles two weeks ago?
2.5 weeks ago.
Since I lived there, and I had never seen Kevin play live, and I was standing up on a balcony on the side of the stage, like above it, so I could have a view of the whole crowd. I understand now that acoustically that is not the best place from which to watch the show, because you're behind the monitors.
The speaker,
the speakers, the PA. But I got to watch the crowd, and I was having a whole set of thoughts about, like, young guys today in this world we live in, where people are really feeling bombarded, I think, by some pretty, like, nihilistic vectors about the future and about a certain kind of rancor and the economy and the climate and the pandemic and, like, what Zoom's done to teenagers. And I think about all this, and then I saw this, like, sea of young faces, mostly male. And they love Kevin so much, and they know every word to every line of every song. And then this guy is wearing a gold leather fringed jacket, and he's throwing roses out into the crowd. And the petals from the roses are detaching and kind of floating down, and these guys are like, I want a petal. And I was just so moved by it, and it helps me to think about who we are and where we are, to see that these, like, young guys they need someone to show them a way to be that isn't crushed by feelings of futility.
Well, thank you, Rachel. Thank you very much. Jeez Louise. Rachel and I met for the first time in person that night at the after party, and your take on the show, which was a sort of consolidated version of that, or not consolidated, just basically that, is very, very kind. And to have a writer that I admire so much sort of take in the whole experience is not something that usually happens. So thank you very much. That's very nice.
Thank you, Kevin.
One of the last questions, I think we might be running out of time. You know, something, a lot of times people will ask me, I now have 7 records out. I have 7 records on my merch table, and people often ask, like, where do I start? And I feel like I always give a very honest answer. I have my record that came out this year, This Is a Photograph, I truly believe is a great starting point because I feel like it sort of encapsulates a whole career. But there have been other times in my, had someone ask me that 2 years ago, I'd say, don't start with the latest one, start with this one.
I love Oh My God. That's what I tell people to listen to.
Well, I'm
it's
glad
like
you
a
like
gateway,
that. That was critically mixed emotions critically.
They're
So
wrong.
thank you very much. Well, so if someone were asked to ask you where to start in your catalog, what to point, even if it was just one essay or perhaps it's a whole novel, where would you point?
Oh man, I don't know. It's really hard. I mean, I feel differently about every book. Maybe the Mars Room because it's like
That's
really
my favorite.
really absorbing and very personal book to me. And I feel like it's really my version of contemporary reality right now, like where we are, and it's about California. So maybe that, but depends on the person.
I've said this before to Rachel, but I'll say to you all now that the Mars Room is my favorite book that you've written. And when I was reading it, I remember thinking, this is a great book. This is a really good book. But it's one of those books that I felt in the last 30 pages, for those of you who have not read it, if you haven't read it, in the last 30 pages, it accelerated in this way where I felt like my heart was beating super fast the whole time, and I was just on this wild ride. And the last line of the book, which I won't say, I don't want to spoil it for anybody who may not have read it yet, but the last line of the book was so profound, and I think of it probably on a daily basis. It was so good, and it really encapsulated, I think, humanity in such a profound way. Just sucker punched me, and it's one of my favorite last lines of a book ever. And thank you very much for making it.
That is so nice. Thank you. Are we supposed to? I think that's a no.
Just speak from your diaphragm.
Take it from one who knows how to use his voice. It's a boy.
I'll let you go first.
All right. Yeah, I am going home tomorrow to finish a novel. Wow. So I've been working on it for a few years now, but like kind of nearing the end. So that's what's next for me. And then I have another novel that I've already sort of mentally kind of drafted out. I have a taste of it, and so I'm eager to get started on that. Life is short, pretty much.
I feel like I have so many more questions now. For me, I'm writing songs. Because of the last experience of making my record, which COVID sort of created this landscape for me to really be off the road for a while and really dig in and sort of do research in a certain way for my songs that I've never done before and sort of live inside of the songs. I really enjoyed making an album that way, and I really enjoyed writing a record that way, and I really want to try to recreate that experience. So I'm never resisting songs. Songs are always coming, and eventually they sort of begin to raise their hand and say, hey, we're all grouped together, maybe you can make a record out of us. That's sort of starting to happen, but I'm not trying to give it too much attention until I'm off the road a little bit. So in short, I am writing some songs, but I'm not quite sure what they are yet.
Oh, yes.
Speaking of music, some writers like to play some kind of music while they write. Others don't want anything but complete silence. Well, what do you prefer? I suspect the songwriter has to shut down other music because that would interfere. But when you write your essays, do you play music to set mood or whatever?
I don't. Mostly silence. Just it's hard to think with music on. For me, there are some writers who do use music. Excuse me. I've had certain things like I'll play a snippet of something to get my mind into a place, but not like while I'm writing. It's more like a set of tools just for mood adjustment. but like weird things. There was like something that someone put up online, an interpretation of a section of the soundtrack to the movie Mishima by Paul Schrader, which was the first soundtrack that Philip Glass ever scored, the first dramatic feature. And it's this thing called Kyoko's House, and it's a very, very weird part of the movie. And someone did a piano version of it on YouTube. And when I was finishing The Mars Room, I listened to that like hundreds of times, just over and over again. So it's not a very thoughtful way of listening to music. It's more kind of like a repetitive thing that you do just to get yourself back into that same mood. But I can't, unfortunately, listen to music and write simultaneously.
Yeah, and you got to just write. For me, I have to turn everything off. Or you do this thing where you'll inevitably write a song that you think is the greatest song of all time. You'll be like, oh, that's because I've been listening to a lot of the Beatles, and I just wrote a Beatles song. And it's a really dangerous thing, and a lot of songwriters do it. And it's happened to me so many times where I'm literally working on a song, and I'm like, this is incredible. And then I hear the song in passing, and I'm like, oh yeah, of course, I just wrote that song. I can't release that now. So you have to be really careful.
But are you like strumming an acoustic guitar while you write to kind of get the...
Yeah,
I don't even know what the parts of a song are called.
it's more like if I'm like really into a record at the time of writing, inevitably I'm going to subconsciously take a melody from that record. So you have to be really careful with that.
But I mean, do you play your guitar while you're writing? That's what I'm asking, like to kind of get a melody down.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's usually songwriting for me. It always begins with the music. Sometimes, every once in a while, kind of like what you were mentioning earlier, you know, where influence can kind of just drift in from anywhere. A line will make itself into my head or something, or I'll write something down and I'll say, I want to put that into a song or base something around that, whether that's the beginning, middle, or end. But for the most part, music has to sort of conjure a feeling for me to then want to write something based off that platform, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. For some reason, I was visualizing like a white Steinway with some rhinestone butterfly appliques on it.
If only.
Kevin, a lot of his videos, he's wearing a bathrobe. I really haven't had a chance to ask him why that is, but it's part of this vision of the white Steinway is the white bathrobe.
You know, a couple years ago, I got very into my heroes' photographs of them in bed, be it Nina Simone or Bob Dylan or Leonard Cohen. It's just like these nice, like, so many people have been documented sort of in those spaces, in their beds or with their shirts off or whatever it is. And I got really into that. And maybe subconsciously, I just wanted to be laying down in photo shoots, not really have to try. Yeah. So maybe that's where it comes from. The bathrobe is probably just some roundabout way of me not having to dress up. But I dress up today.
You certainly did, and you look beautiful, and it's a gorgeous suit.
Hey, thank you. You too.
All right. Well, thank you to both of you. Rachel will be signing at the tent on the plaza after this, if anyone would like to come meet her and get a book signed. But thanks to you both for this great conversation.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Kevin.